Robby, the people want to know, what's on your radar today?
Well, given our discussion yesterday about the seemingly quite large amount of gun violence in the U.S. and in U.S. schools in particular, I wanted to look more closely at the numbers and give you my perspective on them. So for many people, the Uvalde, Texas mass shooting, which claimed the lives of at least 19 children and 2 adults, seemed all the more horrible after they learned it was the 27th school shooting so far this year. Now, that fact makes it harder to view Uvalde as any kind of isolated incident. How could it be? Surely a country with this much mass death has gone wrong somewhere. Now, on Wednesday, an NPR article highlighting this statistic was shared frequently on social media. The headline, 27 school shootings have taken place so far this year, probably implied to many readers that gun-related killings in schools were especially high this year, even before Uvalde. Naturally, the prospect of 26 other previously unnoticed mass casualty events in schools should provoke alarm, but it should also raise eyebrows, because the issue here is that there are 3 very differently defined terms being used somewhat incautiously and interchangeably: school shooting, mass shooting, and mass school shooting. Now, Uvalde was a mass school shooting. The 26 previous tragedies at schools this year, they were school shootings, they were not mass shootings. So the difference is actually quite significant. Education Week, which tracks all school shootings, defines them as incidents in which a person other than the suspect suffers a bullet wound on school property. It doesn't need to be lethal. Many of the 26 previous shootings involved disputes between students in parking lots, after athletic events, that sort of thing. And all of them resulted in 1 or 0 deaths. Now, these deaths are still incredibly tragic, of course. They're fundamentally dissimilar, however, from the tragedies that we saw, for instance, in Uvalde. Uvalde is a mass school shooting in that 4 or more people were shot and or killed. The Gun Violence Project counts incidents in which at least 4 people were shot. Under this definition, many incidents of street crime and domestic violence count as mass shootings, even if there were no deaths that resulted. It's just 4 shootings. Now, a stricter tally of mass school shootings conducted by criminologists for Scientific American, that only includes incidents where the shootings resulted in at least 4 deaths. Using that criteria, the number of mass school shootings in the U.S. since the year 1966 is 13. That's right, just 13 mass casualty events at schools in 60 years. Now, these tragedies claim the lives of 146 people in total, and again, I'm not discounting that at all. It is a terrible tragedy. It should inform policymakers' decisions. Let's talk about what could have prevented it, if anything. But 13 incidents in the last 60 years, it's a much less scary statistic than 27 incidents in the last 6 months. The 2 figures are so far apart because they measure different things. One-off gun incidents are a serious problem in the U.S., and schools are no exception. But mass casualty events, on the other hand, are less common than they seem. In fact, they constitute less than 1% of all gun deaths. The sheer horror of the kind of violence witnessed in Uvalde this week is so unthinkable that politicians, the media, and the public all take great interest in discussing strategies to ensure that such a thing never happens again. But mass school shootings are hard to prevent precisely because they are atypical. Suicides and non-mass casualty murders, usually with handguns rather than assault rifles, constitute the overwhelming majority of gun crimes. Now, since I've already talked at length about why I'm not particularly enthusiastic about Democrats' answer to this issue, more gun control, I wanted to also address the conservative slate of policies, which are similarly unimpressive to me. So some conservatives who support the Second Amendment tout enhanced school security as a superior alternative proposal. Guest on Sean Hannity's Fox show this week went as far as to suggest that schools should install, quote, a series of interlocking doors at the school entrance that are triggered by a tripwire. The Federalist Tristan Justice laments that, quote, Sandy Hook proved the need to enhance K-12 security. Congress armed Ukraine instead. Some ideas floated by people on the right include adding metal detectors, arming teachers, hiring additional security guards. Quote, we know from past experience that the most effective tool for keeping kids safe is armed law enforcement on the campus, said Senator Ted Cruz in the wake of the shooting. I don't like this idea. While it's not yet totally clear what role a school resource officer played in the Uvalde shooting, some reporting suggests SRO may have engaged the shooter but failed to stop him. School security officials have performed unimpressively during previous crises. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School's SRO infamously hid during the 2018 mass shooting in Parkland, Florida. Moreover, placing cops in schools is not a cost-free intervention. The surest consequence is to increase the likelihood that routine disciplinary matters are handled by law enforcement rather than by teachers, counselors, and principals. Doubling the number of SROs in the state of Florida, for example, caused a 4-fold increase in incidents of students being physically restrained by cops. according to a study done by the Education Policy Research Center at the University of Florida. Fights between students, sexting investigations, even problems on the playground that involve very little kids can become the purview of the criminal justice system. An SRO once tried to arrest a teenage girl for violating the dress code. If making schools more like prisons was an unfortunate but much needed strategy to combat an epidemic of violence that SROs were uniquely adept at handling, okay, perhaps hiring more of them would be a good strategy. But in the vast majority of educational settings, this is not the case. Conservatives who understand that the calls to do something, anything about gun violence, invariably produce bad gun control policies should consider that this same rule applies to many of their favorite security proposals. Let's not expand the TSA into schools. Let's just abolish it, please.
So I'm with you entirely on
you probably like the second half.
The second half is great. So the first half, I don't disagree with you. I don't know that I understand the argument that, these weren't mass school shootings, therefore the kind of gun control that is prompted by discussion of these kinds of shootings is not necessary. Other people might not be so galvanized or so shocked and horrified by events that are smaller in scale or involve two teenagers in a parking lot. But I certainly am. I don't think any of these things should exist. I think the fact that there is so much shooting that is happening on school grounds is exactly reflective of how much gun culture has permeated society and how much easy access there is for these people who are young because they're still in school, right? And so I think that it is true that there is a level of attention being paid to this right now, and every time one of these mass school shootings happens, that is not present when other kinds of gun violence, including the kind of routine gun violence that takes so many kids' lives, occurs. And that's frustrating. But that has to do, I think, with the elitism of the corporate media structure, who honestly isn't concerned with when low-income kids shoot each other in low-income environments. Like moments like this are galvanizing.
That's a problem for liberals in the media, for affluent
exactly.
media
It could be my kids.
Exactly.
Right.
It's not going to be their kid on the street in Chicago.
Right.
But, my darling could die in any kindergarten in America. But that thinking is not statistically accurate. And that's what's important to be. Like, we're trying to, if we're focusing our attention on the kind of thing we see in Uvalde, it's, again, horrific. I wish we could do something to solve it. But you're talking about, like, the maniac who does this kind of thing. It is not all that common. It is common for people. It's far too common in this country for people to die to gun violence. I'm not saying there's not gun violence, but this kind of thing, not as common as people.
Robby, even when the number was 27, that's not all that common in the grand scheme of all of the crimes and horrible things that happen in a life. So to me, changing the number is not really what's material, but I do think that it is in kind of like indicative of this broader issue, which is how do you get people to care about the fact that there is this easy access to gun? I mean, we talk about this big difference between school shootings and other kinds of shootings, but at the end of the day, as I talked about in my radar, the problem is that people find it incredibly accessible to buy large quantities of guns with impunity. You have, one store in Indiana that has people buying in bulk and evading what regulations there are in terms of like trying to pace out your gun regulations, knowing it's going to go into Chicago. 60% of Chicago guns.
Some kind of tort solution in that specific case.
Well, they're trying. I mean, the city of Chicago is suing this gun store,
but there
are a lot of tort barriers to gun legislators being liable for how their guns are used. You make these weapons of mass destruction, which are made to take lots of human life. These are not hunting rifles. These are not geared toward precision shooting of deer or elk or whatever. These are designed to take human life, but our brilliant legislators have created barriers to actually getting any kind of tort recompense for people. And I think that is a problem and something that people are going to be talking about a lot more.
I'm more open to torts than maybe other people ideologically of my persuasion. I don't know. I would take
there was really a political reason why tort reform was such a big deal in the 90s, which is that I think conservatives understood that corporations who made harmful products, whether it was pollution, whether it was guns, were able to externalize the harms. Hot coffee. Were able to externalize the harms of their bad behavior on the public without ever having to pay. And that tort law was one of the few things that could keep them accountable. And that's why they were so hell-bent on getting rid of it. And, I think we're going to see a lot more of these conversations developing as we go forward over the coming weeks.
Well, coming up, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer will respond to calls for gun reform legislation, or rather he already did, and we're going to discuss it with our panel coming up next.